Alors, bonsoir tout le monde. Je m'appelle Guy Laforêt, and my job tonight is to present to you the President of the Canadian Political Science Association, François Rocher. Before I do that, first of all, after the speech, you follow Alan Tupper. You go to a reception offered by UBC Department of Political Science, and this is at the Sage Bistro in the Peter Wall Center. You have maps, you're political scientists, you follow Alan Tupper, and should not end in the sea. Ce soir, en premier lieu, we would like to acknowledge that the Vancouver campus of the University of British Columbia, where we gather for Congress 2019, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Uncominum-speaking Musqueam people. Our gratitude extends as well to the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations for hosting Congress attendees on their unceded territories that we now call the City of Vancouver. Alors, j'ai l'immense plaisir de vous présenter le président de l'Association canadienne de sciences politiques, François Rocher, qui est bon à un paquet de choses dans la vie, mais en particulier l'amitié. Et donc, je veux commencer par vous dire et te dire, François, que je considère que ma vie est enrichie par ton amitié. It is not Calvinist predestination, but there was some form of predestination for the kind of work that François Rocher has done so far in political science when one considers the years at which he obtained degrees. He got his first degree in 1980, the year of the first Quebec referendum, then proceeded to obtain his MA degree in 1982. I will not tell you what happened during that year. And then, obviously, in sheer coherence, he got his PhD degree the year of the Meech Lake Accord. So 80, 82, 87, François Rocher was bound to work on Canadian and Quebec politics, on federalism, on intergovernmental relations. And indeed, in a brilliant way, this is what he has accomplished. François s'est mérité toute une série de reconnaissances dans sa carrière, et je ne vais pas toutes les énumérer ce soir, mais je vais néanmoins en mentionner quelques-unes. En 2016, François a obtenu le prix d'excellence de la Société québécoise de sciences politiques, l'association sœur de l'Association canadienne de Sciences Po. Il est titulaire depuis 2018 de la chaire Jean-Luc Pepin à l'Université d'Ottawa. Il a également obtenu en 2005 le certificat de mérite du Conseil international des études canadiennes. I think, like many in the Canadian Political Science Association, when one looks at his career, one sees tremendous community, scholarly, and associational involvement with regards to what François has accomplished so far. And he has never hesitated in accepting a variety of these commitments. I will make one short digression presenting François, and it is the following one. As past president of the Federation, I've been to the board of about 10, 12 associations this year. And the board of CPSA is remarkably balanced gender-wise. It's also one of the youngest boards, and it is courtoisie à l'équipe de direction de l'Association canadienne de Sciences Po et à la nature de la communauté des politologues de faire en sorte que l'association soit dirigée avec un regard sur l'avenir, transmission intergénérationnelle. And if this is true with regards to CPSA, it is true with regards to the various groups and various commitments that have been with François in this, the second half of his career, one has to say, that he is remarkably generous to the future generation. And this shows in the kind of work he has done with Alain Gagnon and others in groups such as Groupe de recherche sur les sociétés plurinationales, de même que le Centre de recherche interdisciplinaire sur la diversité et la démocratie, le CRIDAC. I have many remembrances of partnership and friendship with François. I will share one with you now and let him do the main speech of the evening. Je me rappelle d'une nuit à Madrid où, comme d'habitude à Madrid, on essaie de manger, d'éviter les aspirines, les Advil et les Tylenol, mais c'est très difficile au bout de 3 jours, compte tenu de l'heure à laquelle on mange. Mais une nuit en particulier, il y a peut-être 5, 6 ou 7 ans, avec les longues jambes de François, nous sommes partis du centre-ville de Madrid et en pleine nuit, nous avons marché et parlé sans arrêt pendant 2 heures de temps pour arriver à la Residencia de Estudiantes de l'Université de Madrid, rendue célèbre par Garcia Lorca et plein d'autres. Et cette incroyable nuit d'amitié est très présente dans mon souvenir. I will always cherish that evening in Madrid with you, so I'm giving you the president of the CPSA Foundation.
So I guess I have to turn the mic on in order to not turn you off. Okay.
Thank you. Merci, Guy, pour cette très amicale introduction. J'aimerais remercier les collègues et les amis qui sont ici. Je salue particulièrement Duncan Cameron, qui, en 1987, était l'évaluateur externe au moment de la soutenance de ma thèse de doctorat, et il est toujours avec nous. La question qu'un président francophone se pose toujours au moment du discours présidentiel est de savoir dans quelle langue il va faire ce discours. Je dois dire que depuis 2014, la question a été réglée par Alain Noël, qui a expliqué que le choix n'en était pas vraiment un et que pour être compris, au-delà du symbole, il valait mieux s'exprimer dans la langue des gens qui nous écoutaient. Et c'est ce que j'ai l'intention de faire aujourd'hui. I have titled my presentation, The Life and Death of an Issue, Canadian Political Science and Quebec Politics. And I will explain why. In this address, I would like to examine how political science in Canada, mainly by the English-speaking ones, has conceived of the relationship between Quebec and Canada. While the tendency among my predecessors, many who are with us today, has been to encourage the discipline to be more attentive to new realities affecting groups which have been historically marginalized, I intend to do the opposite. I want to understand why an issue that has been considered central for more than 3 decades has become less attractive, if not marginal, within the discipline. So, like the subject of an anthropological study, I put myself in the shoes of the observer who observes his observer. We must recognize, as others before us have, that intellectuals and university scholars also play a social and a political role. Seymour Martin Lipset and Asoki Bazou have identified 4 prototypes of intellectuals based on the way in which they interpreted their society and culture. The first is made up of those they call guardians of the threshold. She or he acts as a spokesperson for trends in society and aims to identify a universal historical meaning. The second prototype of intellectual is the moralist, whose role is to examine, assess, and evaluate a given circumstance in order to present himself or herself as the conscience of society either in supporting or denouncing the system according to her or his own democratic beliefs or a set of values. The third, described as the protector, seeks to establish and legitimize authority by contributing to the maintenance of the system and portraying the national political tradition in a positive light. According to Lipset, the latter type is the conservative and is more associated with the intellectual who actively participates in the affairs of government motivated by his or her commitments to improve or reform society as envisioned by the political authority who control the state. These prototypes do not really take into account the fact that many scholars do not just observe, support, or challenge the established order, but try to propose solutions or avenues to be followed by their fellow citizens or public authorities. From what I can gather, this typology deserves a fifth type, namely that of a clinician. A scholar or an intellectual who, like a doctor, first seeks to examine the nature of the problem, then identifies the best remedy to reduce its symptoms, or better yet, provides a cure. So my starting position is easy enough to express. Not only I am a scholar or researcher, I am also a political subject. Naturally, I have been influenced by space and time, my place of birth, my socialization, and my academic background. I was 12 years old when the 1970 October crisis broke out. I saw the Canadian military in the streets of Montreal. One of my uncles, a university professor, was questioned by RCMP officers. I am a child of the Quiet Revolution, of the first generation to have attended the public schools and pre-university colleges created in 1967. I became interested in Canadian politics when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Canadian Prime Minister and the Parti québécois was trying to establish itself on the provincial scene. I exercised my right to vote for the first time in the 1976 Quebec provincial election. With delight, I witnessed the adoption of the Charter of the French language in 1977, partially written by the uncle who was questioned by the RCMP. I cast a ballot in the 1980 referendum on the PQ Sovereignty Association proposal. I closely followed the constitutional negotiations that led to the patriation of 1982, and then the constitutional sagas of Meach and Charlottetown. I was hired in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University as a specialist in Quebec politics in 1990 and had to lecture students on Quebec's independence movement in an environment that was not always conducive to calm and rational exchanges prior of the 1995 referendum. My career has therefore been strongly influenced by the analysis of tense relations between Quebec and Canada. Our colleague, or my colleague, and nevertheless friend Guy Laforêt, described our generation as that of the Meech Lake years. The same was true for many English-speaking Canadian colleagues. Richard Simeon, who wrote the introduction to Must Canada Fail? Published in 1977, pointed out that the book was based on several important assumptions. The first was that all the authors in this collection were federalists. Fueled by the challenges posed to Canada by the election of the PQ, they were concerned about Canada's future and the preservation of its unique bilingual and multicultural nature. In another text that surveyed studies on Canadian federalism, Simeon noted that before the Quiet Revolution, the transformation of Quebec's autonomist demands, and the rise of an independence movement. And so before that, Anglo-Canadian political science had shown little interest in Quebec. In short, while Quebec political science was interested in the nation-building process, the one taking place in English Canada was concentrated against drawing on Simeon's text in nation-saving. So the choice of a research topic is a first form of engagement. My intention today is to show that Canadian political science has examined the Canada-Quebec or the Quebec-Canada relationship from 4 different angles. First, its interest in Quebec politics was part of the urgency of the moment, based on the crisis that challenged the foundations of the political system. Secondly, it questioned the legitimacy of the sources of the dispute, namely the compatibility between the new expressions of Quebec nationalism with the presumed principles of which the Canadian political community had been founded. Thirdly, Quebec nationalism also encouraged a reflection on the existence or the lack of existence of English Canada as a sociological and political reality. And fourth, the combination of the first 3 factors caused the prescriptions for getting out of or resolving the crisis to the point of rendering research on this issue almost obsolete. I argue that interest in Quebec politics has gradually faded because, first, the urgency caused by the crisis of national unity is no longer felt, and because the Canadian political space has since been consolidated, so showing less signs of flexibility. This gradual exclusion is also explained by the fact that Canadian society is facing new challenges that are seen more urgent and morally more important to address. And finally, it seems to me that Canadian political scientists have mainly, although not exclusively, embodied the moralist and protective intellectual prototypes. So above and beyond the life and death of an issue, I believe that my reflection appears equally pertinent in helping us think about the conditions that determine the choice of a research subject as a more or less conscious form of intellectual and societal engagement. So let's go back to my first point, which is taking stock of the crisis. So the interest in Quebec society and politics in part stems from the attention given to the grievances articulated in the 1960s. The time had come to understand French Canada as demanding equal status in Confederation and in an understanding of Canada as a constitutive duality. The need is not without some self-criticism on the part of some Anglo-Canadian intellectuals. For example, historian Blair Nidby argued that, I quote, English Canadians should admit that in the past they have only grudgingly accepted the existence of French Canada. On many occasions, we have tried to impose policies which ignored or threatened its existence, unquote. The alternative is quite simple. For Stanley B. Ryerson, to deny or accept the duality is the dividing line between definitions presented as irreconcilable within the Canada-Quebec reality. This impasse could not avoid a more astute understanding of the processes of transformation that were taking place in Quebec. Again, Richard Simeon acknowledged that this awareness was painful. He admitted that non-Quebecers had only really cared about Quebec when a crisis was latent. He also admitted that after a brief period of concern, English Canada had tended to turn a blind eye to the situation. In 1977, He further acknowledged that he was once again caught off guard by the election of the PQ, which was portrayed as a new crisis. It is useful also to note in which terms some renowned political scientists have qualified the action and actors involved in those processes. For instance, for David Milne, this was a war between federalists and separatists. The metaphor is strong and refers to a conflict of interest of such magnitude that no reconciliation is possible. A war is lost or won. It is a political act of last resort. It can be suspended, but it ends with surrender or submission. Peter Russell also described the Quiet Revolution as, I quote, a surge of Quebec radicalism, unquote, undermined by the arrival of Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his political agenda to strengthen national unity. What I want to emphasize here is that the way in which actors are positioned seems to me to reveal implicit preferences that can only have an impact on the type of analysis that will subsequently be put forward. The work of English-Canadian political scientists was that of the protector prototype. The aim was to understand the political dynamics of Quebec in order to identify the conditions for preserving the political regime. The danger having been averted, at least for the time being, attention could now turn to other issues that were seen as a threat to the political order. That being said, is it wise to abandon a study of this issue? Gregory Millard thinks not. In 2008, he writes, quote, whether or not relations between Quebec and the rest of Canada have stabilized in the short term, the existential traumas of the past 4 decades remain fertile ground for anyone interested in questions of identity, value, and ideas in Canadian politics, unquote. Millard's approach is less that of the protective intellectual, as is the case of those concerned with the crisis in the Canadian political system, than that of the moralist intellectual. The main issue raised by Millard is the reconfiguration of the Canadian identity and, more generally, the parameters for inclusion within the Canadian political community. Is this at all possible? This is what will now be at the focus of my attention. Basically, the problem that Quebec represents for Canada is its relationship to otherness. The privileged conceptualization in understanding the problem of alterity is that of nationalism. To put it simply, as I always said to my students, I keep it simple. It is a matter of deciphering the particularities of Quebec nationalism to see to what extent it is compatible or not with the way the Canadian political community is constituted. Moreover, Quebec nationalism has forced the rest of Canada to reflect on its own constitutive elements, sometimes to see how they could accommodate Quebec, sometimes to justify the difficulty of finding a mutually acceptable solution, or sometimes to affirm the absolute impossibility of reaching an agreement. A first trend looks upon Quebec from a perspective of internal colonialism. For Richard Jones, for instance, French Canadians consider themselves consciously or unconsciously as belonging to a colonized minority. This particular image of themselves is at the root of their nationalism, and it is mainly of internal origin. Ken McRoberts recalls the cultural division of labor to reflect the hierarchy of status between Francophones and Anglophones, although he acknowledges that, I quote, "It is not clear that segmentation and hierarchy in the Quebec economy stemmed entirely for a conscious Anglophone strategy to impose and maintain economic domination," unquote. He attributes this reality to the structural conditions created by the conquest, conditions that are being challenged by the emergence of a new middle class that is attacking the economic power of the English-speaking elite that controls much of the Quebec economy, he wrote in the 70s. This change, marked by the creation of a party dedicated to achieving Quebec's political independence, will lead many Canadian political scientists to question the compatibility between Quebec nationalism and Canadian liberalism. The battleground will thus become Canadianized and in turn force political actors and scholars to take sides. The conflict is presented often, if not always, in a binary way. On the one hand, the Canadian liberal system conceives democracy and citizenship in individualistic terms and excludes any notion of rights attributed to national communities. This conception collides with one put forward by Quebec nationalists, which would give precedence, they told, to collective rights. For some, this opposition is just irreconcilable. Others, however, seek to deepen their analysis and wonder whether liberal principles and the need to protect the community from the excesses of liberal individualism are compatible. So the work of theorists and philosophers, they were doing without knowing applied political theory, such as Will Kimlicka and Charles Taylor, fall in that camp. For Kimlicka, it is possible to make liberalism more sensitive to cultural affiliations within the framework of a liberal theory of justice. Kimlicka's contribution is to have demonstrated that the rights of national minorities do not necessarily conflict with those of individuals, since substantive equality can be achieved by requiring the state to grant minorities assistance and recognition. Institutional autonomy, possible within a federal framework, finds there one of its justifications. As for Charles Taylor, he also sought to find a balance between the rights of a community and individual freedom, it being understood that freedom is always contextualized and based on communitarian foundations. So Canadian political science has therefore contributed to deepening the links between liberalism and collective rights from the perspective of the sovereignty of national communities within Canada. However, the difficulty in reconciling collective rights and liberalism has led a number of political scientists to simply reject any form of accommodation. In 1991, David Berkeson and Barry Cooper proposed that Quebec should amicably separate from Canada on the grounds that Canada is a liberal democracy that is seriously undermined by Quebec's nationalism, one based on ethnic and cultural characteristics. Moreover, the two authors argue how repeated attempts to meet Quebec's demand within Canada have jeopardized the Canadian political order and contributed significantly to its economic and social crisis. These interventions are in the vein of moralist political science, preoccupied with determining the conditions for the acceptability of the social and political relations that unfold before it. There is a certain empathy for Quebec's nationalist demands among those who see them as the consequence of an internal form of colonialism, or at the very least, the expression of historical frustrations towards the group perceived as dominant. Others came to opposite conclusions and just condemned everything that seemed to be moving away from a certain reading of classical liberalism. In any case, and whether angle is privileged, the moralist is never very far from the protector. So what about the foundation of the Canadian political community? So the transformation of Quebec nationalism has had the effect of challenging the way Canada has traditionally defined itself. Quebec's alter ego is the rest of Canada, or the Canada outside of Quebec, or more simply Ottawa or the federal government, seen as the spokesperson for English Canada and presented as an undifferentiated group. This representation has in a way forced Canadians and Canadian political scientists to think about who they were and who they are. Alan Cairns judiciously captures this transformation when he states that, I quote, "The citizenry of Rock is induced, initially reluctantly, to see that the comfortable Canadianism natural to the majority in which it had merged itself, indeed lost itself, is eroding under the impact of Quebec nationalism," unquote. In response to this dynamics imposed by Quebec, the ROC began to see itself as a potentially distinct political and sociological entity. But what are its contours? Phil Resnick, hi Phil, reminds us that English is the lingua franca shared by the vast majority of Canadians, with the exception of Indigenous people and first-generation immigrants. Therefore, it is theoretically reasonable to use the term English Canada to designate this national community, given that English predominates in both its public and private spheres. This designation, although satisfactory from the point of view of reason, is politically problematic, and so Resnick asks, I quote, "Is there a sufficient sense of identity as English-speaking Canadians that can allow us to build on a long-established sense of civic nationalism and come to terms with other national identities within the Canadian state?" Unquote. There was a question mark too. So the answer to this question, first asked by Quebec, does not appear as self-evident. Again, this binary way of thinking about Canada raises serious problems. English Canada exists only in the imagination of Quebec's political and intellectual elites. I've written several times. In reality, it is headless and without a spokesperson. While the federal government has a mandate to govern for all of Canada, its vision can be thwarted by provincial governments speaking for a territorially defined segment of the Canadian population. One possible way to reconfigure Canadian identity is to adopt a pluri- or multinational conception of the political community. Multinationalism reflects the presence of what Ken McRoberts has described as internal nations, which is made manifest by the presence of the Quebec nation, but also of Indigenous peoples and, to some extent, Acadians. It does, however, raise again a number of problems, including the reification of so-called national groups. Moreover, the struggles led by these internal nations jeopardize the pan-Canadianism to which a majority of English Canadians subscribe. The principles that underpin the Canadian political system and the representations to which they give rise, namely the equality of citizens, which is reflected within the Charter, the equality of the provinces as enshrined in the amending formula of the Constitution, and of federalism, which contributes to the multiplication of spokespersons for the interests of the ROC, make it difficult, if not impossible, to transcribe multinationalism into Canadian political institutions. Two other responses were given to address this issue. The first is to strengthen the national identity as it has developed over the course of Canadian history. So rather than consider defeat, at a time when the majority of Quebecers see themselves as belonging to a different nation, perhaps It would be better to recognize this reality and not distort the Canadian political nationality by trying to adapt it to fundamentally different identities. After the 1995 referendum, we heard voices that suggested Canada's national identity had suffered from this challenge, and the least that it had been stunted in its development, perhaps even definitively damaged. Another response emphasizes the pluralistic nature of the Canadian identity and the fact that the binational approach is no longer adequate to reflect it. It became just a myth. The debates go far beyond formal constitutional negotiations or issues concerning Quebec and its place in the Federation. Political science is interested in new issues. We all know that. Other arenas of contention such as indigenous issues, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. emerged. They raised questions that are not unlike those that have fed the thinkers of pluralist liberalism regarding the relationship between individual and collective rights, the tension between liberalism and communitarianism, the relationship between justice, equity, and equality, and the conditions for achieving substantive citizenship. This pluralism requires the overcoming of the traditional opposition between English and French Canada. The reflection that ensued ironically contributed to marginalizing the concerns raised by Quebec's political elites. The constitutional negotiations have given rise to the emergence of new voices outside the traditional categories of the two founding peoples, particularly those of ethnic groups and visible minorities, indigenous peoples who challenge the definition of Canada put forward by the two historically privileged majorities, now recognized rights holders having obtained some recognition through the Charter. The idea of a binational Canada, as conceived by the Laurando-Dunton Commission, died with the patriation of a constitution and the entrenchment of the Charter. On the other hand, English Canada refused to recognize itself in the terms put forward by Quebec political actors. In other words, this national entity does not exist as an unified whole. So Quebec nationalists, therefore, have no interlocutors with a reasonably coherent identity to engage. This has contributed to discrediting the terms of the debate as traditionally put forward by Quebec and its political spokespersons. So, my last section, the life and death before you die of an issue. So the evolution of the political dynamic between Quebec and the ROC, as long as such an entity exists, has largely shaped the recommendations made by Canadian political science, either in resolving the crisis or in looking at other solutions. In this regard, many political scientists have put on the robe of the clinician and have written prescriptions to meet the challenges brought on by the transformation of Quebec nationalism. First, in the early 1970s, the initial reaction was to admit that the grievances formulated by Quebec nationalists were founded and that a thorough and complete response had to be presented. That is why Canada must welcome Quebec's request, it was said, for greater autonomy and ensure that the rights of French Canadians are better respected across the country. There was another reaction against such openness. It placed greater emphasis on the effect that the granting of a special status to Quebec could have on the functioning of Canadian federalism. And then I saved you all the list of the problems. But Donald V. Smiley expressed the concern about the possible destruction of Canadian federalism that could ensue if we respond to what Quebec was asking for. Nevertheless, the election of the PQ in 1976, the 1980 referendum, the 1982 patriation, Quebec's questioning of the legitimacy of the Constitution Act of 1982, and the failure of the constitutional negotiations that marked the early 1990s resulted in a call for new solutions. Many studies suggested that serious consideration be given to the possibility of setting up asymmetrical arrangements and to constitutionalize the distinct character of Quebec. This would have required a break with the principles of provincial equality and undifferentiated citizenship. To my surprise, in 1991, Alan Cairns went so far as to propose a limited or even non-existent application of the Canadian Charter in Quebec, with increased powers and constitutional recognition of its distinct character. In this context, a federal and pluralistic Canada means the accommodation of the new Quebec nationalism and the acceptance of a certain degree of self-government for indigenous communities. More recently, in a book that is not out yet, Ken McRoberts pointed out that Canadian federalism and the Constitution cannot be based solely on the territorial dimension and must take into account the different national identities. This would reduce the frustrations and conflicts they generate and challenge the vision of the Canadian nation constitutionalized in 1982, namely, I quote Ken, a quite coherent conception of a Canadian identity which has become the basis of a strong state nationalism, the nationalism of the non-nation, unquote. However, after 1995, new analysis take note of the result of this second referendum. This event had had a traumatic effect and challenged Canadian intellectuals and scholars who saw their role as including that of the guardians of the threshold and protectors of the Canadian political regime. Several voices now call for a tighter legal framework to establish clearer rules for both another referendum and the conditions required for the exercise of sovereignty. Some scholars openly welcome the federal initiatives that are part of what will be called and named Plan B, a set of legal and legislative measures designed to circumscribe the Quebec government's ability to define the political process that can lead eventually to Quebec independence. Once again, political scientists interested in constitutional dynamics and federalism now acknowledge this impasse in the process of renewing the Canadian Constitution. So from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, the way in which Quebec's aspirations were met was an important part of the thinking of Canadian political scientists. Starting in the mid-1990s, the challenge now is to demonstrate that the Canadian political regime and the federal system in particular have succeeded in providing a set of responses considered acceptable for English Canada to Quebec's grievances. On the other hand, after 3 decades of constitutional debate, not only is there some fatigue, but also the fact that Quebec has deepened divisions in Canadian society, and that must stop. Canadian citizenship is so fragmented that it is simply now impossible to attempt to define a collective identity through a mutual satisfactory constitutional language. From this double observation flow 2 possible readings of the relationship between Quebec and Canada. A first one highlights the fact that Quebec's aspirations can be met through unconstitutional arrangements. A second reading, without denying the first, argues that Quebec society has been able to develop and is even stronger today than it was when the constitutional talks began. The argument could be summarized as follows. The proof is in the pudding. Richard Simeon summed up this way of looking at things. I quote him. After all, he wrote, the Federation has managed to survive over a long period. Quebec has been the central force ensuring that the Canadian federal system is in some ways the most decentralized federation in the world. Quebec has been able to use the institutional, political, and financial resources which federalism provides to build a powerful national society. So where is the problem? Where is the problem? I unquote, and then I add, where is the problem? All in all, Quebecers are doing well. It is even difficult to argue that Quebec's national identity is repressed by a dominant and tolerant majority. Thus, Peter Russell's word, I quote, "Since the final fling, the 1995 Quebec referendum, the country has settled back into the normal life of a settled constitutional democracy," unquote. The crisis in the Canadian political system that began in the 1960s has been finally resolved. This issue is, so to speak, dead. Political science, on the other hand, is not. The same is true of the posture of the intellectual guardian of the threshold, moralist, protector, or clinician. The issues surrounding the consideration of multi-ethnic diversity, the neoliberal shift and transformation of the social state, the environmental crisis, and Canada's relation with Indigenous peoples have come to occupy the same moral space as that previously occupied by Quebec-Canada relations and federal-provincial issues. This does not mean that Canadian political science ignores Quebec. It is now doing so by considering the latter as one of the several cases seeking to explain similarities and differences with what is happening elsewhere in Canada or abroad. So Quebec nationalism is becoming one of the several explanatory variables. Quebec is still there, as far as I can tell, and it is the way we approach it that has changed. So let me conclude with the following. Political scientists are not disembodied and detached from the upheavals facing our societies. We are interested in social and political movements that challenge the established order and the shocks that shake up the power structure, whether locally, nationally, or internationally. In a nutshell, I could say that the themes of stability and order are at the heart of most scientific work. It is these concerns that fuel our view of change. The way we do this seems to me to depend on our desire to promote the sustainability of social relations and institutions, or on the contrary, to challenge the inequality of power and representation structures. We do not do this without bias. In this regard, this overview of Canadian political science production on the relation between Quebec and Canada reveals to me that many have, consciously or unconsciously, not only sought to understand the transformation brought about by the challenges posed by Quebec nationalism, but have reproduced their preconceptions, even their prejudices towards Quebec. They have done so with varying degrees of generosity, but most of the time with the unspoken aim of keeping the Canadian ideal to which they subscribed intact. In an analysis focusing on repatriation, Janine Brodie recalled that important political moments do not give rise to a single story. They are configured and constituted by political imaginaries which are forged by dominant, residual, or emerging interpretations. The interpretation in using the conception of two founding peoples belong to the residual category. Nevertheless, it continues to feed those who, particularly in Quebec, still want to rebuild or reform Canadian federalism based on this parameter that is now considered by many outdated. It is the emerging dynamics, those that challenge dominant interpretations, that are now receiving attention. C'est ainsi que vit et meurt un enjeu pour la science politique. Merci.
I'm honored and humbled to be up here, to be the one thanking you. So thank you, Francois. Thank you for not only this presentation, but also for your past and continued contribution to the discipline and to the CPSA. So now just a few words about Francois. An admirable quality of Francois, one of many, is his always frank, direct, cut to the chase and gets his point across, no BS type of guy. I quickly came to know this aspect and appreciate this about Francois early on in my PhD years. Francois was my PhD supervisor. So I was writing my dissertation. I wrote what I thought was a pretty good and necessary chapter for my dissertation. And he looked at me after he read it and asked me, and if anyone knows Francois, he has that deadpan humor, right? And so he asked me, why did you write this chapter? And I'm like, I thought it was necessary. And again, the Francois face, no. I proceeded to apologize to him, and I said, I'm sorry for wasting your time. And again, Francois, very frank, you didn't waste my time, you wasted your time writing it. So this frankness, this cut to this chase, this mince no words aspect of his character is also and clearly evident in not only in this presentation, but in his scholarship as a whole. It's only fitting then that in this talk, and I think as an extension of his paper, quote, The End of Two Solitudes, the Presence or Absence of the Work of French-Speaking Scholars in Canadian Politics, published in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, it is Francois that encourages us and forces us to look at how we study the discipline, how the discipline shapes us, and how we in turn shape the discipline. How do we influence what we talk about, what we research, and why we research this? And the title of this talk perfectly captures the ebb and flow of the Quebec movement and how it reflects when we study Quebec and how we study Quebec and why we study Quebec. It is fascinating to me that the Quebec question isn't as prevalent as it was in the past decades. This seems to clearly indicate, as Francois indicates in his talk, that Canadian politics, both in practice and in study, has room for only one, maybe two paradigm-shifting questions at a time, either Quebec, Indigenous, federal-provincial relations, or equality, equal payments. But all of these issues interconnect, all force us to define what kind of federation or nation we are, whether the different visions of Canada can in fact be reconciled. I think what this talk continues to demonstrate is the fragility of ROC's political and social identity. And this is what Francois reminds us and brings to the table. It's important to understand not only what we study, but also why we do it, what brought us here and brought us to this topic, and why we think the way we do. And in turn, how this affects what we study, how we study our subject matter, and how it affects political studies as a whole. Francois, it goes without saying, likes to push boundaries and likes to push buttons, especially those of the discipline. And he continues to do serious stuff without taking himself too seriously. And he does it all with a Francois sense of humor. As anyone who knows me, I can go on forever, as can Francois, but I'll end here. I look forward to the conversation continuing and going forward over drinks, over the days, over the years. Again, Francois, thank you for continuing to force us to rethink our place, our scholarship, and our discipline.